Welcome back, everyone, to the Future in Review podcast. I'm here today with Fire 2024 speaker Jake Dreyfous. Jake is the managing director at Grow the Flow, an organization focused on restoring Utah's Great Salt Lake, and he will be speaking at this year's conference, October 20th to 23rd at the Terranea Resort in LA. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today, Berit. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. Let's dive right in. So this is a podcast about the future. We talk to a lot of people that are building different parts of the future ecosystem. Let's start with what problem you're solving and why.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I work for Grow the Flow as a managing director, and our number one goal is to restore Great Salt Lake to a healthy level. And so right now the problem we're facing is chronic overuse of water, which has led to the lake's decline over the last several decades. It's gone from the record high in the 1980s all the way down to a record low in 2022, where it's lost over 60% of its surface area and 70% of its water volume. So we've seen this huge change on a really rapid timescale. And some of the ramifications of that loss, are ecological collapse. But for us, the more important issue is the aspect of public health. So the lake, as it dries up, the lake bed creates this dust or this crust on the lake, and that gets kicked up into the air, is full of arsenic, lead, particulate matters, things like that. And so it poses a really serious public health risk for millions of residents along the Wasatch Front.
So I feel like that's the part that gets the most attention in the media, right? Because you're like, oh no, we have arsenic. Everyone knows arsenic is bad, right? We don't want to be breathing that in. Let's talk a little bit also about the ecosystem part, though, because I think that this is a really important. We have a tendency as humans to be like, well, let's talk about the human health problems, and then we'll come back to the ecosystem. But can you explain some of the ecosystem, the impacts to the Great Salt Lake ecosystem and what kind of downstream effects those might have?
Yeah, totally. So there's kind of a few main components when you think about the ecology of Great Salt Lake. So the first being the hydrology of the lake. So Great Salt Lake is directly produces anywhere between 8 to 15% of our annual snowpack here in Utah. So if you like coming out to Utah and powder skiing on this, fluffy, incredible snow, that's at serious risk, which, increases water security issues in an already super dry state. And then Great Salt Lake is also the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. So it's an ecosystem of hemispheric importance for 10 to 12 million migratory birds of 338 species, some of which will go all the way north into Canada on their way north in the spring, and then to another lake called Mar Chiquita. So there's really global connections with the lake through these migratory birds, super important hydrology, and then we also have brine shrimp. And Great Salt Lake produces 45% of the global brine shrimp supply to aquaculture farmers. So if you eat table shrimp or tilapia or something like that, there's a really good chance that it was being fed by Great Salt Lake. So there's these interwoven connections through food, through industry, and through ecology that really make Great Salt Lake important.
And so you and I have talked a little bit about this already, but for those who don't live in Utah and don't eat shrimp, the Great Salt Lake is part of this global ecosystem of other saline lakes. Can you explain why saline lakes in particular are so important, not just the Great Salt Lake, but around the world?
Yeah, totally. So across the world, there's somewhere between 100 and 120 of these saline lakes, almost all of which are in chronic decline. So you can think of places like Lake Urmia in Iran. You can think of the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea. In California, we have Owens Lake and the Salton Sea. And all of these lakes, are a really important source of refuge for shorebirds and are vital to global economies with things like mineral extraction, brine shrimp production, and their watersheds that they hold are almost always sources of agriculture. And that's what's causing a lot of these lakes to decline across the world is chronic overuse by agriculture and the lack of sustainable solutions to help these farmers, but also help the lake.
So it's interesting that you say chronic overuse by agriculture. I think that's true of a lot of bodies of water and not just lakes, right? If we look at rivers, that's often kind of attributed to decline in river volume. Do you see, like, what is it about agricultural practices that have become such a draw in the last few years? You mentioned this as being a more recent development. Is it an expansion of the volume of crops that are grown? Is it the types of crops? What has changed that has been driving this?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is definitely a decades long problem, right? I mean, in the case of Utah, I mean, we that are still using technology that was put in place by original pioneers in the middle of the 19th century. You can think of unlined dirt canals, flood irrigating all of these pastures to grow alfalfa and other cash crops, and a move away from local food production and creating systems where we can grow and eat the food that we grow on a local level, which often will lead to water conservation and savings. But really, the crux of the problem is, using outdated technologies that we just expect to keep working when really we're in a reality of increased water demand from population growth, and also less stable water systems due to climate change. So we see the solution as really lying in our ability to implement water saving technologies at scale, in the Great Salt Lake watershed.
Let's talk about those technologies. It's interesting that you would say that. Are there specific technologies that Grow the Flow is advocating for within the agricultural community? And what are
Yes.
the barriers to adoption?
So the state, our state legislature, they've actually done a pretty good job of funding opportunities for farmers to improve their land and subsidizing the cost of that. So right now, that looks like putting in drip irrigation instead of flood irrigating, or moving to center pivots, or automating your water system. And while these are all really, really important and are part of the solution, there's still immense barriers of entry for farmers as far as the costs of these products. You can think of a center pivot costing, six figures for a farmer. And even if that's subsidized at, 50%, a lot of these guys aren't turning a profit. And,
Right.
for them to be able to take that risk to implement this new technology that they're not familiar with, that maybe they're not sure about culturally, is really a big barrier to entry there.
Do you see a way around that? I mean, if what we're talking about at the end of the day is like a financial challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, have you seen any promising solutions that might,
Yeah,
like,
I think.
who's doing what's working, and where have you seen optimism?
Yeah, I mean, I think this money that the state has funded so far, it's like $200 million for these ag optimization grants, and that is a really big step. And we have seen some buy-in and some success stories within the watershed of people that have been able to leverage these funds, not only improve their land but also improve their profitability by doing so. So that's really reassuring for us. But there's also this, kind of cultural barrier between and hesitancy to trust the state, or trust environmental
Right.
groups like our own to buy in
Right.
to the reason that we even need to save the Great Salt Lake. And so I think continuing to have those conversations, providing additional incentives or subsidies for ag to be able to partake in these programs without that inherent risk is going to be a really important next step.
And what is it that Grow the Flow is doing in particular? And like, how do you see your role? What is your role in this ecosystem?
Yeah, so we're a fairly new organization, and when the lake hit its record low, we were really noticing like a lot of siloed efforts. Right, you had the state doing one thing, you had environmental groups screaming from the top of the roof that we need to do more, and meanwhile no one was talking to each other. And so we really see Grow the Flow as the organization can help bridge these divides and connect these distinct voices and efforts to amplify the effectiveness of uh, Great Salt Lake rescue. Because if you have 100 different people, staying in their own lane and not talking about what everyone else is doing, it leads to bureaucracy, redundancy, and a lot of duplicative work. And frankly, we don't have the time for that. Like, we need to reverse the lake's decline in the next 5 to 10 years, or the ecosystem is going to collapse.
And so, are you able to have some of those conversations? Like, how are you bridging those gaps? What?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that we're working on right now is agricultural listening sessions. So just providing a platform for these farmers to voice their concerns and really say, this is what I need. I think by doing that, it's just an act of trust building and relationship building. And if we can get to a point where farmers aren't hesitant to trust the state and the solutions that they're promoting, it's going to be a lot easier to implement these changes at scale and have community buy-in across the watershed. And so we really are focused on community organizing and political advocacy, and then also work closely with the Policy Institute at the University of Utah to try to draft solutions for the lake, and then use our public network to then provide the support or pressure that's necessary to pass those solutions. But it's hard. We're working in a double Republican supermajority, and so using these kind of mainstream talking points that really only speak to liberal or left leaning ideals is not going to work in Utah. So it's really about deep relationship building and being willing to work across the aisle to find those solutions.
What has surprised you about your conversations with stakeholders so far? One of the things that I see a lot is in the US in general, but I would assume this is true in Utah as well, is just like a general animosity, right? Based on someone's political affiliation, which I don't find to be personally, I don't find to be helpful or useful, because there is a lot of that I think we can agree on if we actually have open conversations about it. I'm curious what from those conversations may have surprised you as far as what you've learned from farmers.
Yeah, I think the kind of biggest
Or
takeaway,
politicians. Yeah.
yeah,
Go
the
ahead.
biggest takeaway for me is, like, if you lead with politics, you don't go that far. But if you lead with your values, if you lead with the fact that this is an issue that poses a risk to future generations of Utahns like myself, who want to live here all their life, who want to raise their kids here and provide them with the same opportunity that I have been privileged to have by living in this state, that gets you a lot further. And people recognize the value by leading in that way. And I think some of the biggest things that have surprised me as far as the agriculture community in specific is, a lot. One of the themes of these conversations have been, if we had another marketable crop that wasn't alfalfa, right, that we could make money on, that wasn't as water intensive, we would be doing that. Like that's their takeaway. But creating those markets and providing them with the alternative financial avenues, that's the hard part that needs to happen.
Interesting. Okay, so the alfalfa is for them a very water intensive but also financially viable crop for them to grow. They don't feel they
Yeah,
have an alternative to that.
and that financial viability is becoming less and less true. Even, I mean, we had one farmer who was telling us the other day, the cost or the price per bale of alfalfa is around $100, and his cost for a bale is 180. So he's almost losing double the money that he's putting into it, just trying to grow this. I mean, these producers are really time and time again describing farming as an expensive hobby and not a way of life. A lot of them have second streams of income to subsidize their losses, and so there's really this secondary issue that is we're forgetting who feeds us, and we need to really rally together as a community to support our agriculture industry, which is vital to our longevity as a state and as a country.
When you think about salt lakes around the world, what is it that you hope to export from grow the flow that might be applicable in these other communities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, every saline lake is different as far as, what solution is going to work for them. But, I think we're uniquely poised in Utah to be the first people to solve this issue for a couple reasons. I think we have an ability to come together when something is really important here in Utah. And we're also a very small, tight knit community. So when we buy in, we buy in wholly. And I think once we get this figured out, be that through agriculture technologies that are implemented at scale, implementing sustainable mineral extraction practices across the lake that are generally non-consumptive in their water use, which isn't the case right now. Like things like that, and providing that roadmap for other lakes like Mar Chiquita in Argentina. We work closely with a program down there to bring kids to other saline lakes across the world, and kind of develop that next generation of leadership. Or with Lake Urmia in Azerbaijan, that's obviously big and transnational. So that's a really complex issue there. But I think being able to put together this toolkit of solutions and bring that to other lakes that are kind of in the same state would be incredibly valuable.
So it sounds like you are already talking to these other communities about what they're trying. Are there solutions from other communities that you're bringing in and bringing back to Utah?
Yeah, the one example that I can think of just off the top of my head is Mono Lake in California. Actually, I think pretty close to where we'll be in October. That's sort of the overwhelming success story. And what happened there is an environmental group sued the state of California under the public trust doctrine, saying the state of California has an obligation to protect this resource for the benefit of the people. Our organization isn't a part of this lawsuit, but a parallel lawsuit under the public trust doctrine has been filed in Utah by Earth Justice and several local organizations, trying to leverage or pull the legal lever and try to reverse the lake's decline. So that's kind of one success story. And then
So what was it that they actually once the law? So I'm assuming that they won the lawsuit, right? It was a success story in that way. How did that change? What was going on around Lake?
yeah, so there's been significant decreases in upstream depletion. So when we think about these lakes, they fill up by getting more water into them from the rivers. So water goes in, no water goes out. That's why they're called a terminal lake. That looked like decreased agricultural depletions, water savings on a municipal level, through city councils and things like that. But even these really robust and important changes that happened at Mono Lake, they've pretty much only stabilized the lake. They haven't even filled it up to what was established as, the ecologically viable level in that lawsuit. So even these legal levers, they need to come with significant cultural change and a willingness to, buy in for the lake.
Yeah, I guess my question is more like, how does winning that lawsuit, like, what are the mechanisms that are then put into place? Is it like greater emphasis on policy around farming in that area? Is like what's happening after the lawsuit is won that has made those impacts? Even just the stabilization.
Yeah, so that looked like dedicating water rights to the Great Salt. I mean, not excuse me, to Mono Lake, reducing agricultural water rights and depletions as a result of that, and establishing like a really robust monitoring system so they can actually track how much water is making it to the lake instead of just sort of making an educated guess. And that's kind of where we're at with Great Salt Lake right now is really building out that robust monitoring system, because before we know how much water we need to know how much water is getting there. And I think the fact that we don't have that really shows how much work we have to do to get to a healthy place.
Absolutely. Okay, so Jake, you grew up in Utah. Why is it you studied environmental science, correct?
Yeah.
How is it that you came? I mean, clearly the Great Salt Lake is a big deal in Utah, but how is it that you personally came to this challenge? Like, what is it about this that drew you in? You could have been
Yeah,
working on any environmental challenge.
I really appreciate you asking that question. I think the more that I've done this work, the more that I've noticed that Great Salt Lake has really been integral to almost every component of my life. I'm a big bird watcher. I hunt ducks. Before I did this job, I was a fishing guide on the lake's tributaries. Grew up camping in the mountains at the top of the watershed. And, you know, when I realized the severity of the risk of losing the lake, I just couldn't stand to even envision a future where my own kids or my own friends or future Utahns didn't have these opportunities that really shape the way that I view the world. Um, you know, Fishing as a kid, camping as a kid, skiing the lake snow. These are all the reasons that I decided to go and study environmental studies and biology, and immediately come back to my home once I graduated to take action for Great Salt Lake. I don't see a more important environmental issue in the state of Utah right now. And, for me to be able to give what I can to this cause is really fulfilling, but it also feels like I'm giving back to my state that's really raised me in a lot of ways.
It, Thank you for saying that and for sharing that. I have personally have had a similar experience. I grew up on a small island in Washington State, right? And I think there's something, I'm lucky enough to still have family on that island. I've been going back, I grew up there, but I also go back all the time. And there's something, I find that there's something very powerful about being anchored to a place over time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And watching that place change. There's so many people in the world today who move around a lot,
Yeah.
right? Just by nature of the tech industry and the job market. Most people are moving from city to city every couple of years. And you miss out, I think, in that scenario
Mm-hmm.
on building that sustained connection with place,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
which is a very powerful motivator in doing local organizing work.
my roots are really deep in Utah. I'm a fifth generation, and kind of going off of that point of watching that change over time. One of the stories that I like to tell about Great Salt Lake is there's this spot just past the state park called Black Rock. It's a super historic monument. It's really famous for Western landscape artists. Was a prominent landmark for indigenous communities as they traveled along the lake shores. But my grandma, when she was a kid, she used to, not only walk out to the rock, but actually have to swim out to Black Rock. And they would climb up, halfway up, jump off the rock into the water, and just float effortlessly in the saline water. And it was only recently that I went out there for the first time myself. Maybe in the last year. And you drive out, you take a little walk, and then you expect to be on the lake shore, but Black Rock is 500, 1,000 yards away from the edge of the water. And I think that's really illustrative of how this ecosystem has changed. We're in a state where this lake is just constantly shrinking. You watch a time lapse and it looks like breaths getting shorter and shorter, almost as if the lake is reaching its end in that way.
I'm curious. There's this so we clearly at Future Interview look at things from usually the 10,000 foot level, right? We're looking for patterns, we're looking for global trends, we're identifying, how do we have the most impact when it comes to, transitioning to renewables, that kind of thing. And as we've just been discussing, local action is so often such a huge part of what drives meaningful change within a community.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what lessons have you learned in doing this work about that connection?
Yeah.
And how do you think about that for people who maybe work at a high level doing, like, how do we build more bridges between those two communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've learned that it's hard work. You really need to be willing and open to engage with people that disagree with you, meet them where they are, and be willing to compromise. I had a conversation with someone from Mono Lake a few weeks ago, just kind of telling me about her own experience, and she said, compromise on everything that except the essential, and that's something that really stuck with me, and I think is applicable to sort of this macro level too. I think um, sometimes technology companies or corporations, they can really be stuck or tunnel vision into this mindset of like, how do we improve? How do we grow? How do we do better and be better? And, kind of lose that ground level or connection with the consumers that should in a lot of ways kind of be guiding that conversation. And yeah, and then on the flip side, I've just been overwhelmed with joy and hope just by these people that are passionate about Great Salt Lake. You have retired school teachers and conservative legislators and bird nerds who have been on the lake for 40 years, all kind of coalescing behind this cause, and it's a really beautiful thing to watch unfold.
That's awesome. I love that. I think we should end on that phrase, which is compromise on everything except the essentials. It's a good reminder and not really the way that we often go about our day-to-day lives, or we're Americans in general are encouraged to go about their day-to-day lives. So I feel like that's a powerful reminder. Jake, so great to have you with us here today. I'm so excited to be with you in LA in just a couple of months. October 20th to 23rd. And I also very much appreciate your note of optimism about the many people who care about what the Great Salt Lake. But I think that's true in general. That's something that I've found. It's when I look at what makes me optimistic about the future, I have the great pleasure to talk to all of these people that are working in all these different areas and are super passionate about what they're doing. And when you see all of those people in each of their, different silos, and see the potential connections between them, I think that's a very, very powerfully optimistic lens. So thank you for being a part of that.
No, thank you for having me. I like to say that belief without action turns into grief, and belief with action turns into hope. So, if you can kind of play a part and understand your own role, regardless of what the issue is, it's a lot easier to think that we have a chance of doing it, because, instead of just facing fear, you're hundreds of people who believe in the same thing that you do.
Thank you for being a part of that.